Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Hope Frontier podcast. And today we're going to take a look at the character Balaam from Numbers 22 through 24. So instead of breaking this down chapter by chapter, it's probably easier just to look at the whole story as one unit. So we're going to take a look at Balaam and see how he really acts, what is he doing, and how does that really transfer to our lives today. Because obviously the Bible was written thousands of years ago, but it's still relevant to us today. So let's set up the situation here. And this was in Numbers 22, if you want to follow along in the Bible. So this is after the Israelites have went through the wilderness and they're going marching. And actually what happens is before this scene started, they fought and deleted the Amorites. So King Balak, he was a Moabite king. He heard about this, how the Israelites defeated the Amorites. And so he's freaking out, right? And the whole big picture of Balak, in my opinion, is that you really can't fight against God's will. This king was proud, and he wanted to control everything his way. And his theme really is that all of us humans, we cannot fight against God's will when God has decided something. And you'll see throughout the whole story, Balak continuously tries to force his will, force his might, and get his outcome his way. But God does not work that way, and God just smashes him, basically. And it's really easy for us to get in this mindset where we as humans want to control our outcome. So we do this either through our job or through our hobby or some way where we want to force exactly what we want rather than what God has in store. And that's a big trap for us. So Balaam was actually a real historical figure. In case there's any sort of doubt about this, they have found inscriptions of Balaam in the Deir Allah. And this was found, dated back at least 800 BC, if not earlier. And they found inscriptions of Balaam in the temple there, where they talked about him being this famous seer who he had all these visions from the gods, and he was really, just like the Bible describes him, he was communicating with the divine. And he had an ability to speak with them, and his words were able to cast curses or blessings on people. And one thing we do have to understand about the whole story, because we're connecting throughout the whole Bible here, is that this is spiritual as well as physical. So even though this story is about Balaam, Balak, and Israel, it's also about the gods of Moab, the gods of the Amorites, and the God of Israel. Because the God of Israel is coming back to reclaim his land. And so this is spiritual and physical, and God always shows both of those whenever he does anything in the Old Testament and New Testament. Nothing is purely physical. There's a whole clear theological and physical messaging that happens when God is acting in the Old and New Testament. So we're going to start in verse 2. It says, Balak, son of Zippor, the Moabite king, had seen everything the Israelites had done to the Amorites. And when the people of Moab saw how many Israelites there were, they were terrified. Now, just a quick pause. The Israelite people were just supposed to walk through and go to the promised land. They weren't really supposed to mess with Moab because God had given that land to the Moabite people. So the fact that Balak is going to attack the Israelites, he's really causing this problem for himself because it's not even a real problem. And there are so many times in our lives when we create problems that shouldn't even be there. We anticipate something horrible, but in reality, we're just overanalyzing something and making it a bigger problem than what it really should be. And this is one example when really if Balak had just prayed, or even if Balak had used Balaam to ask God what he was doing, then Balaam would have easily told Balak, hey, they're just kind of walking through your land. They're not going to cause you any problem. Just don't bother them. Please just give them their blessing and let them go. But Balak never really asks what God of Israel is doing, and instead he's acting out of fear and acting out of panic. And we can see throughout the whole Bible that every time people act out of fear, then there's huge problems. So let's not act out of fear. If we're facing some hardships, facing some challenges, let's really ask God what is going on here. Because that would have solved all of this Moabite king's problems, and he still would have lived. He died because the Israelites killed him later. So in verse 5, Balak sent messengers to call Balaam son of Beor, who was living in the native land of Pethor near the Euphrates River. And we'll skip down to the second part of verse 6. He says basically, please come and curse these people for me because they're too powerful. Then perhaps I'll be able to conquer them and drive them from the land. I know that blessings fall on any people you bless, and curses fall on any people you curse. Sorcery and this cursing and witchcraft, it's real. It's not just a joke in the Bible. It's not just people not understanding science and all those things. That's really not real. Balaam had an ability to communicate with these spiritual beings. He was famous throughout the whole region, and he contained this ability to really harness these incantations and way to just talk to these spirits. And he used that. Now, in the ancient Near East, people would either use this for good or for evil. And to be honest, there's really no way to use it for good because the spirits they're talking to are the spirits that are in open rebellion against God. So anytime these spirits are saying good things to humans, you have to think about why they would do that. Why would spirits want to say good things to people? Well, the answer is they want people to worship them instead of worshiping the true God of the Bible. So in any way that they can make people trapped into worshiping them, they win. So you will see that all these spirits, they're not just causing evil upon people, but they could be intentionally causing good for people in order to draw them away from God. So Balaam had this ability to tap into these spiritual beings, tap into the spiritual world, and he made a whole living out of it. He was like super famous. Okay? And we're going to see throughout this story that what does Balaam try to do? What is Balaam's real deal here in this story? And Balaam basically tries to manipulate the spiritual world, bending it to his will. He thinks that he has power over the spirits. He thinks that he is wise and he is intelligent and has this special ability. But he's going to find out that you cannot manipulate God. And that is something that a lot of us as humans, heck, let's just say every human has tried to do sometime. We think we're smarter than God. We think that we can work the system in order to manipulate God. But God cannot be tricked and God cannot be fooled. And that is one thing that we really have to keep in mind during our life, is that God really sees through what we're trying to do and our hidden motives. And a lot of people think this wrong concept that, oh, if I'm just nice, then God will bless me. Or if I just tithe money, then God will bless me with more finances. And although those are nice thinkings, if that's how you base your life, God may not honor that. Having this relationship with God is not transactional. It's not I do this and you do this for me. That's not how it works. And God knows that. And God can't work with you if that's your theology, because that's wrong. God actually wants to build your faith. So this concept of, if I do this, then God will do this for me, it's really intrinsic, and the motivation is wrong, because we as humans cannot use God to get what we want. We can't just say to God, hey God, if I just marry a Christian, then you'll bless our marriage and I'll be happy. Well, that's not really loving God, loving the other person. That's just trying to make your life better, right? And it gets a little blurry with the lines because, God does want us to act in a right way. God does want us to really do things that are wise. But at the end of the day, we can't trick God with our motives. And so I think deep down, all of us really know what our true motive is. Is the motive of what we're doing, is that really to honor God, to worship God with our hearts, or is it to make our life better and not really caring about the relationship of God? Okay, so in verse 8, these messengers from Balak come to Balaam to ask him, hey, we'll pay you. Please come curse Israel. So Balaam says in verse 8, stay here overnight. In the morning, I'll tell you whatever the Lord directs me to say. And so the officials stay with him for 3 days. Now, interestingly and importantly, Balaam uses the Israelite name of God, Yahweh. He doesn't use a Semitic way of saying God. And we know that obviously God of the Bible has shown himself to the whole area, his name of Yahweh, because he destroyed the Egyptians through the plagues and his name was spread. That was God's plan, right? Because he wants to show his name, show his power to the people, and reclaim the lost land that was taken over by the spiritual evil of Chemosh and Ashtaroth and all those other spirits. So Balaam knows the sacred name of God, which is Yahweh. And he actually basically interacts with God with that name. Now, Balaam is not a true worshiper of Yahweh, but he does know his name and does contact with him. And this really brings up the interesting part where God does talk to people who are not believers. We know that's true because in the Bible, in the Old Testament, even until this point, there were other times when God spoke to non-believers. He spoke to Laban, he spoke to Abimelech, and these people didn't honor or worship him at all. So God clearly can communicate with them for a specific purpose. And that's what happened here. And so I think that's a really good encouragement for you and for me, because as we're living out our lives, it is really tempting to just think that we're all alone and God has no impact in what that other person is doing that may be negatively affecting us. And that's not true, because God does speak to non-believers. He can do it in any way, shape, or form, and you have to realize that God is protecting us and God is with us. And so that's a really great encouragement for us. Now, interestingly, the way that God talks to Balaam is quite similar to the way that God speaks to Moses. And we're going to see a lot of similarities actually between how Moses and the Israelites work with how Balaam and Balak work. There is a very similar feeling here. And it really just goes to show us that, despite how people are in this world, God is the same, and God's mission is the same, and God will get the outcome he wants no matter who it is. Right? So it doesn't matter if someone has this wrong theology or if someone is in absolute opposition to God. If God wants something done, he'll make it done. And that's really encouraging for you and for me. So now we're going to start seeing how God interacts with Balaam. Balaam has this swagger, this belief that he has this divine communication skill. But he's going to find out quite quickly that it's not Balaam speaking to God. It's actually whenever God wants to, he will speak with Balaam. And the way of communication gets very clear from the beginning. So in verse 9, that night God came to Balaam. It's very clear and it's very important because Balaam did not come to God. Balaam cannot just interact with God anytime he wants to. That is his wish, but sadly that's not the reality for him. God is the one who's doing the approaching. And once again, Balaam had the view that he could command and he could manipulate God to what he wants. And here we go, just like our lives today. How many times do we tell God, do this now for me? How many times do we tell God, this is how it is to be for me? And God says, that's not how I'm going to work. And here we go. This is Balaam showing us thousands of years ago that people are the same. And if this super famous prophetic seer who actually spoke with spiritual beings can't force God to do something, then there's sure as heck no way that you and I are going to do that. And so God came to Balaam and was asking him, who are these men visiting you? See how Balaam's going to react. And God told him, don't go. You're not to curse them, for they've been blessed. And you got to give Balaam a little credit here, because he does understand, heck, if God is the God who told me don't mess with them, I'm not going to mess with them, right? So he says in verse 13, go home, the Lord will not let me go with you. So he refuses. You got to give him that props, right? Because he knows that at least he's not a spiritual being. God can smite him, right? But that's not good enough for Balak. Because remember, Balak's acting out of fear, out of panic. So he's going to do whatever it takes to win and push his way. And so Balak sends his messengers back. And then God says to Balaam at nighttime, same way as last time, God came to Balak. Since they've come for you, just go, but do what I tell you to do. And this is great because once again, God is the one who is going to take this situation and make it positive when everyone's trying to make it negative. And then what happens next is the famous story of Balaam and his donkey, where Balaam starts going and this donkey sees this angel of the Lord 3 times. And, Balaam keeps beating the donkey because it's stopping or it's hitting him against the wall because the donkey doesn't want to die, right? The angel of the Lord has his sword drawn and the donkey says, I'm not going to get involved in this at all, basically, right? Now, obviously, the intention of the story is to show up at this point that this man who claims to be so in tune with the gods, who can communicate with them at will whenever he wants to, is so blind because of his own pride and so blind by his own self-proclaimed power that even a lowly donkey can see God, which Balaam cannot. And interestingly, this angel Lord perhaps is the figure of Jesus or figure of Yahweh. The only times in the Bible when the angel of the Lord has a sword drawn is when it's in reference to actually Yahweh incarnate. We can see that in the book of Joshua. And so then the Lord gave the donkey the ability to speak, right? And so the donkey just tells him, hey, what's wrong with you, man? If I ever done this before, please wake up. And then, once again, who's the one in control of the conversation? The Lord opened Balaam's eyes in verse 31. And Balaam bowed his head down and he repented of his sins because he was so blind by what he thought in his own head. So once again in verse 35, the angel of the Lord told Balaam, go with these men, but say only what I tell you to say. So God is once again in control the whole time of the conversation with Balaam. Balaam, although he worships other spirits, God will use that man in order to further his blessing on his people. So in verse 38, Balaam just tells Balak straight up when he meets him, hey, I'm here, but I have no power to say whatever I want. I will speak only the message that God puts in my mouth. So he's telling him up front that God of the Bible is in control. And this is really important for a few reasons. The first thing is, once again, we're going to see this strange sort of symmetry and parallelism between Balaam and Moses. Because the way Moses speaks is, then Yahweh spoke to Moses saying. And we'll see the way that it describes Balaam is the exact same. Then Yahweh spoke to Balaam saying. It's basically word for word the same. Technically it's not because Balaam says me, but whatever, close enough, right? God is speaking, God is working through both people in order to advance his kingdom. So even if Moses isn't doing his right job, God will use somebody else. And when opposition and opponents to Moses come, well, God will use those people to further his kingdom anyways, which is great, right? When God wants us to do something as his children, we will succeed. It's us that sabotage ourselves. Just like Balak is sabotaging himself because he's acting out of fear and panic, we can sabotage ourselves, and God will find somebody else to further his kingdom. So let's really not miss out on what God has for us. And the second thing, which is really important about this, is that in their thought, in their idea, these spiritual beings were territorial. So the god of Moab, the god of the Amorites, was in control of that territory. And the very fact that Balaam said, I have no power, I will only speak what God puts in my mouth, is once again showing that Yahweh has total control over every dominion, every territory. There is no place that doesn't have his control. So before we get into the blessing part in chapter 23, let's just keep an image once again on this parallelism. Balaam stops the donkey 3 times and beats the donkey 3 times. And we're going to see that Balaam and Balak go do this cursing 3 different times. And once again, no matter what happens at the end of the story, God is going to open eyes and show them how powerful he is. So it's really just important for us to keep in mind that as the Bible works, it really wants to showcase and highlight a lot of details. Now in chapter 23, verse 1, Balaam said to King Balak, build me 7 altars here and prepare 7 young bulls and 7 rams for me to sacrifice. So here once again, what's Balaam doing? He's doing his way to force God to act upon his will. And, God does not work that way. Balaam wants to do this curse. Balaam wants to enact this ritual in order to communicate with these spirits. But the Lord is not going to work that way. The Lord will communicate with him his way. He cannot force his way upon the Lord. So in verse 3, Balaam realizes this and says to Balak, stand here by the burnt offerings. I will see if the Lord will respond to me. So Balaam already realizes, hey, something's not right here. I'm trying what I usually do, but I need to see if God will respond to me. So then in verse 5, the Lord actually does give Balaam a message for King Balak. And we'll see that it's actually a total blessing for Israel, and it's a curse against Moab, which is super funny, right? And King Balak, of course, is mad. So then this happens again the second time. Balak tells him, okay, let's go someplace else. And he wants to go to a place where Balaam can see Israel. Because if he can see Israel, then he'll be able to channel the curse stronger. Once again, in the Old Testament, they have that concept of the evil eye. So if they're able to see somebody, they're able to really have a stronger curse upon the people. So Balak is really trying to push harder his will and his desire. And Balaam says the same thing. Hey, stand here and I'll go meet with the Lord and we'll see. And once again, there's nothing Balaam can say that is apart from what the Lord wants. And so this happens the third time. And this is where it starts getting even more fun. Because in chapter 24, verse 1, it says this, by now Balaam realized the Lord was determined to bless Israel, so he did not resort to divination as before. Instead, he turned and looked out toward the wilderness, where he saw the people of Israel camped tribe by tribe. Then the Spirit of God came upon him, and this is the message he delivered. So Balaam didn't even need to resort to his tactics. He knew by now that there's nothing he can do apart from the will of God. He realized that, hey, all my tricks, all my manipulations, all my wanting of control is useless because God is truly in control of this situation. And so he gets infused by the Spirit of God. So once again, a non-Israelite person, a non-believer, was overcome by the Spirit of God. And so he does a really big discourse here, where once again, he is talking blessings over Israel and curses above everybody else. And King Balak just flies into a huge rage against Balaam, right? And he's just so angry because everything that he wanted backfired. Because Balak knew that this isn't just physical. This is spiritual. If the God of Israel is strong and empowering the Israelite people, then it will be so difficult for him to overcome and defeat them. This is spiritual in nature, and so he needs this curse upon the people so they can take down their blessing. With this blessing they have, what happened with the Egyptians, what happened with the Amorites is going to repeat for Balak. And so he takes it so seriously because it is real. And he's just angry because he told Balaam, I promised to give you riches and rewards, but you didn't do anything I even told you. And, give him some credit because once again, he tells Balak, hey, I told you I would be powerless to do anything against the will of the Lord. Balaam realizes that the God of Israel is stronger than him, and he cannot actually manipulate the God of Israel. And so after Balak's rage fit, Balaam doesn't stop. He continues going actually even more and ends up really prophesying about Jesus to come and rule the world forever, which is really ironic because you have this pagan prophesying about the Son of God coming to rule the world forever. So you got to love God's great sense of humor here. I think it's great. And one thing here about this story is that Balaam does understand and realize God's power here. Actually, I'm going to highlight just one little part from the first blessing that Balaam does to the Israelite people. This is in Numbers 23, and I'll just read verse 10. Who can count Jacob's descendants as numerous as dust? Who can count even a fourth of Israel's people? Let me die like the righteous. Let my life end like theirs. So here you can see that Balaam really actually understands that God's power and blessing is with these people. And he even just says, hey, let me die like the righteous. Let my life end like theirs. Balaam realizes, hey, if I follow this God of the Bible, this God who's of the Israelite people, then I might be able to die righteously. But we know through the whole story that Balaam's heart really does shift left and right. At times, he does seem like he understands the power and the authority of God, but sometimes he still is selfish and still wants to do everything his way. And this happens to all of us as we continue to live our life. There are moments when we see God's authority and God's power and say, okay, you're right. But then the next day, our heart can change, and we want to manipulate God in order to fulfill our selfish desires. And that is exactly what's happening. And so Balaam has this struggle within his own heart about what to do. Should I follow this God of the Israelite people? Because I want to die righteously, obviously. Or should I do things my way and get my selfish desires fulfilled? Turns out that he chooses the selfish desires in the end. Because we'll find out in chapter 25 that Moab does a trick and a tactic that was offered by Balaam in order to have the Moabite women seduce the Israelite men, make them worship the God of the Moabites, which would in turn then rip away the blessing that God has with the people, isolate them, and God would then judge them. So Balaam uses his intelligence and his knowledge about this covenant relationship that God has with the Israelite people in order to trick the Israelites and subvert them into this worship of idolatry in order for Balak to destroy Israel. But we find out in chapter 31 that Balaam dies in war from the Israelite hand. And that is the justice that he gets because he did a lot of damage to Israelite people. And, when you go against God's will, there is judgment for that. And it's sad because we don't like when people are judged. But as you can see with Balaam, he himself, compared to anybody else, had so much knowledge about Yahweh and knew so much about how God was and what his life would be like if he followed him faithfully. But Balaam loved his power. He loved his wisdom. His pride was so strong that he thought he could manipulate and use the spiritual beings in order to fulfill his own selfish desires. And that became his downfall. And that is really something that, like I said, we really have to be careful of, because it is so easy for us to always think about our selfish desires and how God can fulfill our selfish desires. But this brings up the good question: is it really selfish for me to want something good in my own life? And obviously, I don't think that's the case. I think there's a healthy way to be motivated. There's a healthy way to be ambitious, as long as it's tempered by our faithfulness to God. Because when we are doing what God has us do, we're going to want to be ambitious. We're going to want to push ourselves to grow and develop and do great things for the Lord. But at the same time, we're going to understand that it's not by our strength. It's not by our power. If it's not God's timing, let's not force that, because God has a reason. God has his method of doing things. And we need to understand that and really bow down in reverence to the fact that God, in the end of the day, chooses what is good and what is wrong. And just as the pot has nothing to say against the potter, we cannot be the ones who try to manipulate God and get angry at him when we don't get what we want, thinking the way we want it is correct, right? So I hope you liked today's podcast about Balaam, and we look forward to having you join us next time on the Hope Frontier podcast.